All right, so David Wood recently said, if you're a Christian, you know why you're a Christian. This is the time to start telling people. And I was raised Christian, became an atheist, and eventually became a Christian again. And so I thought I would speak up about the things that make me a Christian. I'm going to be talking about the cosmological argument and the fine-tuning argument, and those alone won't make you a Christian, but they point in that direction. But as a preliminary matter, I need to attack a whole lot of these central ideas of the atheist worldview, because I know as an atheist, back when I used to be one, there's these certain ideas where as soon as you see Christian content, you're thinking these ideas. Like, well, this violates logical positivism, therefore it is, you might not be saying that in your head out loud, but you go, well, that whatever evidence you're citing isn't measurable and repeatable, so it's not valid. And so they've programmed themselves to throw out data in this way using really, really bad logic. So as a preliminary matter, let's go over this idea. All that exists is matter and energy, right? With the new atheist movement, if you're one of these Western atheists, all that exists is matter and energy, and the only causal forces are the laws of physics. So there's just the stuff that's out there in the laws of physics. No supernatural, no ghosts, no soul. All that exists is these things that are measurable and repeatable and verifiable. There is no should. Yeah, so if there's no should, and this is where they always make a jump, because they'll say things like teaching originals. You shouldn't teach original sin.
The realization that there's no such thing as original sin. That what a disgusting idea.
You should believe atheism. You shouldn't believe in God. But none of that is able to be founded on their worldview with their metaphysics, because in their soup of what exists, their metaphysics, their idea of what is out there in the universe, all they have is statements.
Atheists cannot get an ought from an is.
There is a certain amount of hydrogen here. There's energy there. It is such and such a spin, so it's a boson, whatever. All these properties of things, there always is statements. There's no should statements. If you throw out should statements, though, you have no moral duties, including epistemic duties. This is the big one, right? So epistemic duties are like your duty to assess evidence critically to find the truth. You have to throw that out if you're a materialist. They don't realize this, but you can't support a should statement if should statements don't exist. That's a problem. Once that sunk in for me, my atheism started to crumble. That was what really killed it. Before that, I had, everyone's always talking about how you can't have moral duties with atheism, and I was like, fine, but it's still true. Once the value of truth and the duty to believe truth was annihilated, that's when I was like, okay, well, I need to reassess my worldview because this doesn't make any sense. Another implication is there's no free will, even if duties did exist.
But we probably don't have free will.
I say that it's not merely that free will is an illusion. The illusion of free will is an illusion.
So there's no duties, there's no should statements, but even if they did exist, you couldn't do them anyway because you're causally locked with the physical laws, with the laws of nature and physical matter. You're causally locked. There is no agent there. There's no person who chooses to do this or that.
The self is an illusion. The sense of being an ego, an I, a thinker of thoughts in addition to the thoughts, an experiencer in addition to the experience. The sense that we all have of riding around inside our heads as a kind of a passenger in the vehicle of the body. That's where most people start when they think about any of these questions. Most people don't feel identical to their bodies. They feel like they have bodies. They feel like they're inside the body, and most people feel like they're inside their heads. Now, that sense of being a subject, a locus of consciousness inside the head, is an illusion.
It's only the electrochemical reactions that are all dictated by physics down at the micro level. So, what are the implications of that? Well, you can't say religion is evil. Uh-oh. That's like all the new atheists do. You also can't say religion is false in a meaningful way. Uh-oh, that's all the new atheists do. That's their whole worldview right there. Oh, you said to kill the Amalekites, right? It's evil. It's evil. The homosexuality, hell is evil. And then you can't say that religion is false meaningfully. Oh, the genealogies are off. Jesus didn't exist. None of that is able to be supported with the new atheist worldview. Okay, so if you ask them what evidence is when you're debating them online, a lot of times they can't even answer the question. They just want to keep attacking. They've been programmed to just attack Christianity. They call it religion, right? But when it comes down to it, 99% of the time, they're just attacking Christianity. And you ask them for a definition of evidence, 9 times out of 10, they can't even define evidence, right? But the ones who can, they usually define it as evidence is supported by these kinds of epistemologies. So they're all some form of you need to be able to see it and hold it and taste it and touch it, right? So logical positivism is the idea that you should only believe a statement, or a statement's only meaningful if it's measurable and repeatable. Okay, so that's once again that sensory perception, feeling, tasting, touching. It's only meaningful if it's measurable and repeatable. The problem with this is the idea that you should only believe something that's measurable and repeatable is itself not measurable and repeatable. So if logical positivism is true, then logical positivism is false. It's self-refuting. And that's how it is with all of these new atheist epistemologies. Something's very wrong with this worldview. The more you think about it, the more stupid it gets. Scientism is the idea that you should only believe in things that are based in science, that are proven by science. What do you think the problem is going to be? This is not a statement that you can get to using science, right? So science is, you get an object and you measure it and you see its mass, you do something to change it, and right, but there's nothing in that whole experience, that whole method of doing science, that has a should statement or that implies a should statement. So me measuring the box doesn't imply that I should only believe things that are like a measurement of a box. Consciousness is an illusion according to these new atheists, but then they also think that we should only believe things that are verified by the senses. Well, what is it that's conducting these senses? The conscious mind. The same thing they're saying is an illusion is where we get all the data that they're saying is the only proper data. It's all from an illusion, but it's the only thing we should trust. Like, what is this worldview? It's so stupid. All right, so the statement that you should only believe things proven by science is not something you can prove by science. It's just something that someone made up, and you can use it to attack religious ideas, but what the new atheists don't realize is that it attacks all of metaphysics. All right, verificationism. This is the idea that a statement isn't meaningful unless it's verifiable. This is once again just the same idea that it has to be measured with your senses, but verificationism itself is not measurable by the senses and self-defeats. So what are the implications of this? Well, look at all these dumb statements you have to deal with by the fedora wearers, right? If there's, religion's evil. Okay, well, if there's no duties, how is religion evil? There is no evil. You can't have evil. There's no ontology for evil. Evil can only exist in a system where there are should statements. Lawrence Krauss, in his debate with IP, was talking about how it's a good thing that there's no free will. If there's no free will, then why blame the religious for being religious? They can't choose to do otherwise. See how stupid this gets? It just gets dumber and dumber the more you think about it. If there's no purpose, why attack religion? They talk about there's no greater meaning, there's no larger purpose. It's just a pitiless, indifferent universe. That's a quote from Dawkins. Okay, well then shut the hell up, right? Because there's no purpose, so shut up. If evolution benefits, why defeat religions made by evolution? Evolution has made it where almost every human population across the entire planet is religious in some way. And I'm using religion. I don't like the way that new atheists use the term religion because I think what they have is also a religion. Here's how I would define the word religion. Religion is your answer to the deeper questions in life, like who am I? What is my purpose? What am I supposed to be doing? What are my duties? What's the big problem in the world? How do we solve the big problem in the world? Etc. That's a religion if you have answers to these questions. So I would classify communism as a religion. I would classify like the woke movement as a religion, new atheist movement as a religion, etc. You can't escape it. All humans are religious at some point, unless you just are a nihilist. You believe there's no point, like I did when my late stage atheism. Once I realized humanism is just a huge bluff, there's nothing there. I became a nihilist, and that's where you believe everything's meaningless. All right, that other than that, it's all religion. Okay, but if evolution benefits, why defeat religions made by evolution? All these humans out there across the world believe in these supernatural beings. Something about this must be benefiting our survival, or it wouldn't be there according to naturalistic evolutionary theory. And so if you go and undercut that belief, are you going to hurt human progress? Are you going to hurt the ability of the human race to procreate? And seems like that's the case. The more secular you get as a society, the less babies there are. How is humanism true if materialism is true? So materialism is the idea that there's just matter and energy out there and the laws of nature, and that's all is statements. But humanism is a bunch of should statements. Humans should have dignity and human rights and all this crap that's stolen from Christianity. You can't have any of that if all that exists is matter and energy. How is scientism true if scientism is true? Scientism is the idea that you should only believe in things proven by science. That idea that you should only believe in things proven by science is not provable by science, and on it goes. It's totally a self-defeating nonsense. The same things that they use to attack religion can all be turned back on their own worldview and obliterated. It's a stupid worldview. Okay. So here's a better definition of evidence. I'm an attorney, and I like the Texas Rules of Evidence. This is explaining what makes evidence relevant. And it's basically whatever increases the likelihood of a theory, that's evidence that's relevant. Okay, so let me read Texas Rules of Evidence 401. Evidence is relevant if it has a tendency to make a fact more or less probable than it would be without the evidence. Right? And 2, the fact is of consequence in determining the action. Look how broad that is. There's none of this stupid language about it has to be verifiable and measurable and repeatable. It's just if it increases the likelihood of something happening, then it's evidence. And you can just kind of see with your mind that this is correct. This is how we use evidence all the time. What's funny is I one time had a atheist debating with me saying that the Gospels weren't evidence of anything, and that as a lawyer I should know that just because some dead person wrote something down, that doesn't count as evidence. And it made me bust out laughing because I work in wills, trusts, and estates. All the wills are written by dead people, and you admit them into court as evidence of what the people wanted, and they have self-proofing affidavits of witnesses that a lot of times are dead. So it's just stupid. If you take these new atheist ideas and actually apply them in the real world, your worldview falls apart. If you only believed in things that are measurable and repeatable, you would have the knowledge base of a caveman. Because think of it, if I'm reading anything in a book or something and they're telling me data, I'm not actually verifying it for myself with my eyes. Even scientific books, when you're reading them, you're not actually the one who's verifying it yourself with you're relying on the eyewitness testimony of the scientists. See how stupid this is? So if you're saying, I only believe in measurable and repeatable things, not eyewitness testimony, everything you know is eyewitness testimony. You did not do those experiments that taught us the science. That was scientists. You're relying on their eyewitness testimony. Okay. All right, I have to get all this out of the way because the new atheists are so programmed to think that they're so intelligent and materialism is the future and everyone else is stupid. No, you're stupid. Everything about your worldview is stupid. And I have to point that out before I can even get into my argument because the thoughts are so loud in new atheists of, oh yeah, science and progress and all this. No, shut up and listen for a minute. Everything you believe is stupid. We're going to go through that and then we go into... where's your evidence for God? We'll go into that, but you need to realize everything you believe is stupid first. I only believe in things based on evidence. Really? Well, mathematics. Okay, what's your evidence that 1 + 1 = 2? Right? There is no evidence. There's no verifiable, observable evidence that 1 + 1 = 2. You just know that. You just know it logically. Modus ponens. You don't know this because of observation. You just know that if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. If I pick up this pen, it means I'm pissed off at new atheists. Oh, look at that. Look at that. I picked up the pen, right? So then you can know Q, I'm pissed off at new atheists. I'm not picking up the pen. Now you can know I'm not pissed off at new atheists. That's modus ponens, right? If P, then Q. No Q, therefore no P, right? So I didn't pick up the pen this time. You can tell I'm not pissed off at it. But you know all that without measurable and repeatable evidence. You just know it as a rule of logic. That's sentential logic. Memories. You don't believe your memories based on evidence. Your memories are what you use to collect data on evidence. So, okay, I believe there's this pen right here, and now I'm relying on my memory. Well, what is the evidence right now that my memory is true? There isn't any, right? I'm just using that memory as a foundationalist would say, as part of my noetic system's foundation. There's no evidence of my memory, right? And I could go and recheck and see if the pen is there. But in between those checks, there's no evidence that the memory is correct. There's all sorts of things you believe without evidence because they're more foundational than evidence. Evidence is almost like a second step in gaining data about the world. You have to know what inductive logic is for the evidence to even mean anything, right? So if you go into a room and you don't have any logic, then you're just in a room full of junk. In order to start making hypotheses and have the evidence mean something, you would have to have the rules of logic. So imagine you're just like a complete idiot and you don't know what you're doing, and you walk into a room and you see someone who's stabbed with a knife, but you don't know what a knife is, you don't know what life is, you don't know what death is, you don't know, if P then Q, P therefore Q, you don't know inductive logic, you don't have abductive reasoning. The evidence doesn't mean anything. The verification doesn't mean anything. The logic is the real driving engine in the human system. First-person subjective experiences, including scientific observations, are not something you can prove with evidence. They're something you have to presuppose in order to collect evidence. How are you collecting the evidence? With eyewitness testimony. Everything we know about the world is through eyewitness testimony. You can't prove it with evidence. That's more foundational than evidence. And then inductive logic, but I could add abductive logic and deductive logic. All forms of logic, none of them work. None of them are based on evidence. They're what help us interpret evidence. They're more foundational than evidence. And so already this is a problem for the atheist worldview if you're a materialist. It's like, why are there all these forms of proper thinking if everything is made of non-mental matter dictated by non-mental physical laws? If we're all like sand in a sandbox, we're all like a campfire. Why is it that we have these intuitive feelings about what's the proper way of thinking if we're not created by an intelligent God who gave us proper ways of thinking? Anyway, you can see it just creates problems everywhere. They take all this stuff from Christianity, like the idea that humans are rational. Well, we believe that because we're made in the image of God. We don't believe that because we're the result of accidental, non-mental, electrochemical and physical reactions. You can't get to that conclusion with we're just random chemical reactions. And then, even if you granted that we got all these rules of logic and everything from random chemical reactions, wow, it's almost like they were all fine-tuned in order for us to reach that point. Anyway, okay, so we're going to start with cosmological arguments. I'm not really a big fan of the word cosmological. It's really just beginning arguments. We're talking about the beginning of the universe. And there's Thomist ones, Kalam ones, Leibniz ones, and I kind of just combined them all into a single soup of a cosmological argument. I'm not a philosopher, and so I can't say all these rules super clean and technical like a philosopher would. But David Wood in his video saying you need to talk about why you believe what you believe. He said you don't need to know everything, and this is good enough for me, right? So maybe it's good enough for another dummy out there who's as dumb as I am. 1, you can't have an infinite chain of causes or contingencies or time. And we'll get to that by these Bernardetti paradoxes, and because you can't traverse an infinite. Like I can't sit here and count to infinity. We'll get to that in a second. 2, contingencies, causes, and beginnings don't happen for no reason. All right, and this is something called the PSR and causal principle philosophers go through all these little details about each one of those, but really it's just the idea that things don't happen for no reason, right? So you can't have an infinite amount of stuff that led up to today and things don't happen for no reason. Okay, so this is setting up an argument for God. These chains of causes or contingencies, beginnings, so all this junk that led up to today are dependent on something that starts the chain, right? So I exist. Why do I exist? Because of my parents. Why do they exist? Because of their parents. And on you can go backward. But we know that the chain of causation or contingencies can't go forever. And so something had to be the first cause. That thing that starts the chain is God. Okay? Whoop. All right. Beginning. Traversing an infinite is impossible. So there's all kinds of arguments for this and thought experiments, but the easiest one for dummies like me is just you're living in the present right now, and if there was an infinite past, time would have never gotten to this moment, right? And I even debated this with Alex Malpass on Facebook, and he talked about how, well, you can't just assume that you exist before this infinity and then it comes to the present day. And so I was like, okay, fine. And so I was like, how about I exist in the middle of this infinity? And whenever you split an infinity in half, it creates two infinities, right? So there's infinity before this past moment, and then there's infinity after it, and now we're in the present. You still can't ever pass up this infinity to get to the present. So I don't see a way out of this. This was the most compelling argument for me then, and it is now. And it's just so obvious. It's like, well, obviously there had to be a beginning or we'd never reach now. And so I'm intuitively grabbing this idea that when something is increasing incrementally, it never reaches infinity. You can't sit here and count cards and get to infinity. And if you just say, well, there's infinite time, you're just throwing abstract ideas at the problem. You're not really solving the problem, because the way it would have to work is there would just have to be an infinity that already exists in the past, and then things have just been added on incrementally over time since then, because we know time is being added incrementally now, but that doesn't make any sense. Why would time work as an abstract mathematical set in the past, and then at what point? We know at some point things had to be getting added incrementally, right? And so it's a problem. That seems way more ad hoc and clunky than just there's a beginning and we reach this point. 2, infinite number of days causes contingencies before today. Well, yeah, that's just still the problem of traversing the infinite. And then you can't have an unlimited number of conditional prerequisites. So to show this, a lot of times philosophers will argue with these things called Bernardetti paradoxes. And so a famous one's the Grim Reaper paradox, and I'll give a version of that, but that's tailored to my interests and my family. So I have a daughter who loves dinosaurs and she loves princesses. And so you can tell this is such a dad paradox here. So let's say that she loses her tooth and there's an infinite amount of tooth fairies out there. We know that at least one of these tooth fairies is going to switch her tooth for a dinosaur princess cupcake. Dinosaur princess cupcakes are special because the only place in the entire universe to get them is from tooth fairies. Okay, so one of these tooth fairies is going to switch out their dinosaur princess cupcake with my daughter's tooth. And they're going to do this tonight. At 12 a.m., there's going to be a tooth fairy that will switch out the cupcake for the tooth if no one else has done it. Okay? So that tooth fairy at 12 has her alarm set, and boop, it went off. Oh, let me see if anybody else has switched out a cupcake for the tooth. Nobody has. Okay, I'm going to do it. So we know for sure that next morning when my daughter wakes up, she's going to wake up and find that her tooth is gone and there's a cupcake there. Okay. Now, before that fairy, at 11:30, there's another fairy who's going to switch out a cupcake for the tooth if no other fairies have switched out the cupcake for the tooth yet. And we're going to keep splitting the time between 11 and 12 and half, right? So 11:30, there's a fairy. 11:15, there's another fairy who's going to switch out the cupcake for the tooth if no other fairies have done so. At 11:07 and 30 seconds, there's a fairy who's going to switch out the cupcake for the tooth if no other fairy has done so, and keep splitting the time in half infinitely because there's an infinite number of fairies. You wake up the next morning, and there's a cupcake there, and now here's the question. Which fairy switched out the cupcake for the tooth? Here's the problem. For every fairy that you answer did the switching, you can just say, well, what about n+1 fairy? What about the fairy after that? What about the fairy after that? What about the fairy after that? And so this paradox, these Bernardetti paradoxes, capture this idea that you can't have a causal connection come from an infinite because it'll never manifest. Just kind of like traversing the infinite in the last one we did. Now, philosophers like Joe Schmidt say, well, this is just an undiagnosable or unsatisfactory paradiagnosis. And that's basically just the idea that there's nothing wrong with infinite causal chains. There's just something in our thought experiment that can't be added to other things. I don't think this is a good objection because he just seems to be pointing out the problem that something doesn't make sense here. And it seems to me the most obvious thing that doesn't make sense is the infinite causal chain. It's that inability of infinity to ever manifest a specific point incrementally that makes it where causation can't work infinitely or nothing would ever happen. It seems obvious to me, but okay. Some people really struggle with that. Okay, so that's causal finitism, temporal finitism, all the sorts of things you need for a Leibnizian or Kalam or Thomas argument. Okay, the next step is the idea that things just don't happen for no reason. Things don't happen for no reason. If they did, knowledge collapses, right? So we do kind of all kinds of experiments. Let's say I'm trying to dissect a pig to see how the pig works. But if I have the idea that those things in my head that I'm learning could come for no reason at all, then there's no reason to trust that I'm learning about the pig. It might just be that random stuff's happening in my brain for no reason, right? So actually, knowledge collapses if you reject the PSR. And this is kind of interesting because it's once you start learning more of these arguments, you see how the atheist answers to these arguments all kind of have the similar problems. So in later on, we'll be talking about fine-tuning, and one of the answers to that is this idea that there's a multiverse where there's just all these sorts of random things that can be happening all the time. There's an infinite number of... There's always an infinite in these atheist answers, and it makes problems. God can get around that, and I'll explain why later. There's an infinite number of universes with randomized natural laws. If that's the case, then you can't trust anything that you're seeing right now because you could just be in a universe that like a Boltzmann brain universe is what it's called. You're just in a universe where everything just appears to be the way that it is because of random fluctuations of the multiverse and not because you're actually seeing things. And so I think that Boltzmann brain, what's it called? Counter argument to the multiverse has a lot of overlap with atheist attacks on the PSR. They both lead to this ridiculous, what's causing me to think what I am? And you can't put that same thing on God because God has moral duties and God adheres to truth. And so it's possible that God created a universe where everything just looks like it is the way that it is. But it just seems way less likely on theism. Because theism, if you have a multiverse, you have whatever takes the least amount of energy to get the same results as the most likely universe that you're in, and so you're more likely to have a Boltzmann brain universe. Whereas a theistic universe, it seems like it'd be very boring for a god to create, just a single entity that's hallucinating. Okay, so if you throw out the PSR, knowledge collapses. There's also more dialectic to guard the PSR. A lot of times philosophers just say it's axiomatic, where you can just see with your mind that things don't happen for no reason. I think that's true. But here's an argument anyway, in case that doesn't persuade you. Modus tollens. If P, then Q. No Q, therefore no P. Okay, PSR. If things were happening for no reason all the time, we would see things happening for no reason all the time. I'd see a duck appearing behind me and my lips would turn into a beak. I don't know why everything's bird related. I would just like, my butt would catch on fire and I'd fly away. There would be no reason for any of these things, right? But we don't see a world that works like that. And you might go, well, in quantum mechanics, a particle can appear in a randomized spot when an observer looks at it. Well, that doesn't violate the PSR, and that doesn't prove that things happen for no reason. I think proper versions of the PSR are pretty general, right? So the principle of sufficient reason, you could call it the principle of adequate reason, as long as there is a system there where such that you're able to give an explanation for why something is happening, you haven't violated the PSR. There's an adequate reason for that particle to appear right at that point at that particular time. Even if it's randomized, it's fine. And you can say a statement like that and not be in any hot water if you have Aristotelian metaphysics. Okay, PSR doesn't mean determinism. So just because there's always a reason for something, that doesn't mean that there's no free will. So in the same way that the principle of adequate reason made it where quantum mechanics is okay with randomized variables, the principle of adequate reason can say that there's a reason for me to drink this water right now, without it being the case that whatever causes me to drink that water entails me drinking the water. So let me explain. I'm thirsty, and so I can choose to drink the water. It doesn't mean I will, in every possible world, I'm always going to drink the water right at this moment, right? Like right now, I'm not drinking the water. And so it's just the case that there needs to be an adequate reason for something. It doesn't need to entail it. It doesn't get rid of free will. It's not debunked by quantum mechanics, okay? It's just a sufficient or adequate condition. Same with quantum mechanics. Okay. Is God the first cause? Yes. What does necessary mean? So there's in the Leibnizian version, there's two kinds of things you can have: contingent things that rely on other things, or necessary things, right? There's a necessary thing out there. And so instead of saying, is God the necessary thing? Well, let's start talking about what the necessary thing would have to be. So we've already established in the prior slide that you can't have an infinite regress of causes. And so we know at some point there has to be that first cause. There has to be this first unmoved mover, this thing that itself isn't in a causal chain. So we know from that it's changeless, right? Nothing is acting on it. It's prior in the causal chain. We know that it has to exist necessarily because it's not contingent on anything. So you have a necessarily existing changeless thing, right? It has to exist before time, because time works in a sequential incremental, has a sequential incremental nature where one part is added to one part is added to one part. And so you know that it can't surpass an infinity. So we know it had a beginning. And so whatever it is that caused time to begin at the Big Bang had itself to exist outside of time. So far, our first cause is necessarily existent, it's changeless, and it's timeless. Now, material things made of up quarks, down quarks, and electrons, as we understand them, they're always changing. They're non-spatial. They're never at 0 degrees Kelvin. But so there's always changes going on within matter. So whatever it is that did the Big Bang in time, it had to be non-material. So it's a necessarily existent, timeless, non-material, changeless thing. You can get to it necessarily existing too by talking about something called the modal ontological argument that we get from Plantinga. And I don't need to go into all the details of it, but basically if you can establish that it's possible for a necessary being to exist, then it's necessary for this being to exist in all possible worlds. And so if we can at least even say it's possible that there's this God that's a first cause that's necessary, then there is a God who's the first cause that's necessary, right? And so this coheres well with what we're doing with the Kalam so far. No causation in its ontology. Well, let me pause and I'll go back to the reason that's a big deal is because we're if any of my arguments have made you go, well, I guess it's possible that there's this God out there. Once you grant that it's possible, it becomes necessary that there's this necessary being out there. It collapses that modal logic collapses, and it's not modal collapse. That's another thing. But it does create it where now you can be sure that there's a God, if you can even grant that it's possible there's a God, because he's necessarily existent in every possible world. No causation in its ontology, right? So that's that same idea of it's not the end of a causal chain. It's not the end of a temporal chain. There's no causation in its ontology. It was just always there. It's this necessarily existent, foundational being that's always there. Single cause. This is technical to get to this, but the simplest argument is just Occam's razor. We should assume that it's a single cause until there's some reason to think that there's multiple causes. But this also gets us around, if there were multiple causes, then there seems to be all sorts of contingencies on how they would interact with each other. And this simplifies that if it's just a single cause doing this. All right, so power is the ability to effectuate change, right? So apple trees have the power to make apples. Cars have the power to drive off. And power, this ability to effectuate change, comes to us from something else that had power, right? So the sun has power that puts energy into the grass and the plants, that puts it into the animals, and we eat the animals and we get that same power. Okay, so power either came into existence for no reason or it has always existed. Those are your only options, right? And we know from the causal principle and the PSR, or the principle of adequate reason, whatever you want to call it, that things don't happen for no reason. And so it's not the case that power came into existence for no reason. Power has to have always existed. Okay, this is starting to get a little more godlike, right? All-powerful foundational power. So there's a power out there that has always existed that gives everything else its power. And whatever this thing is that has this power, it seems that it would be the case that it can't have a limit on its power, because if whatever's limiting its power, it would be this deeper, more foundational principle that's putting restrictions on how much power this original thing can have. And then now that thing is in the causal chain of something made it adequate, the conditions for this being to exist, and so this being is no longer the biggest, most powerful thing. Whatever it is that's interior to this being is the most powerful thing. And so we can get the idea that whatever this necessarily existent, uncaused, changeless, timeless, spaceless thing is, it's all powerful. It is the foundation of all power. It's all powerful, and it gives foundational power to everything else. Okay, this one would take time to go into that I don't have right now, but basically in other places I've argued that mental causation is the only kind of causation that isn't physical things and laws of the universe causing something. So if a tornado kills someone, we just go, okay, well, that's matter and energy and the laws of nature that killed that person, right? But if I go and stab someone, you don't go, well, that's matter and energy and the laws of nature that killed that person. You go, Christian gadfly killed that person, right? And that's from my mental causation with my mental states. That has there's a causal agency to the human mind that exists outside of the laws of nature. I think this is true of animals too. But, and so we have free will. The mind isn't limited to physical reality, and this is why. Physical reality is all describable in third-person terms of matter and energy. So you can describe everything in the material universe as such and such amount of energy at such and such a place, such and such amount of matter. And that's all describable in third-person terms of matter and energy. But right now, you're hearing my voice, you're seeing this computer screen. That's a first-person subjective experience. That is not describable in third-person terms of matter and energy. And so you can know that whatever it is that you are, it is something more than just the stuff you're made of. And here's a thought experiment for this. Imagine there's this woman who's born colorblind, and she learns everything about the color red. She learns about the electromagnetic radiation in the spectrum and retinas and eyeballs and how they work and photons and everything. She learns everything there is to know about the color red, but she's never experienced the color red. One day she's healed and she's able to see red. All right. If materialism's true, at that point she would get no new data. But hearing that, you and I both know that when you see red for the first time, that first person subjective experience is something new and different and separated from the third person describers.
I say that it's not merely that free will is an illusion. The illusion of free will is an illusion. The self is an illusion. The sense of being an ego, an I, a thinker of thoughts in addition to the thoughts.
Okay, if the self is an illusion and free will is an illusion and consciousness is an illusion, who the hell is talking right now? Who is it that I'm staring at, that I'm listening to? This is what's so stupid about this. I just can't even get my head around how dumb this is. I don't understand how people believe this crap. Okay, so consciousness, the thing that you use in your free will, you use those to do your scientific observations, but only scientific observations should be trusted, not consciousness and free will. Those things you relied on to do the scientific observations. See how self-refuting this stupid worldview is? It's all like this. It's so dumb, and the new atheists are so blind to it. If there's any property of X that isn't in Y, then X does not equal Y. So those subjective experiences, it's called qualia by philosophers, that what it is likeness of like seeing red or hearing my voice or watching the computer screen itself cannot just be the brain. Okay, so all that being set up, the only non-physical thing we can think of that has causal properties is a mind. And so whatever this thing is that was the first cause, it's something like an immaterial mind. Okay? And you can push this even further using the teleological argument, which is like fine-tuning and all that, that makes it look even more like a mind. But the fact that it has causal power and it's not physical alone already gets you to, inductively, looking around us, the only thing we can think of that acts like that is a mind. And so you have an all-powerful foundational power that is a mind. It is a single mind, has no causation in whatever it is that brought it about, right? It just exists. It necessarily exists. It's changeless. It's not material, and it's timeless. We got all that just from the cosmological argument. Okay, so who made God? Nobody made God. He's a necessarily existent being. There. That's all. Dawkins needs to quit saying this argument. He doesn't need to make it anymore. This has been solved for thousands of years. Okay, this is a stupid argument. Okay, conclusion on cosmology. You can't have an infinite chain of causes or contingencies or time. Grim Reaper, Bernardetti type paradoxes. We did the Tooth Fairy one. Contingency causes and beginnings don't happen for no reason. We talked about if things happen for no reason, there'd be, I would turn into a dinosaur right now. That doesn't happen, so we know things happen for a reason. These chains of causes, contingencies, beginnings, began, or are dependent on something that starts the chain. Something has to light the match for the Big Bang, right? That thing that starts the chain is timeless, spaceless, immaterial, foundationally powerful mind that is singular, unmoved mover without limits. There's no constraints. Ooh, wow. Okay. Fine-tuning. And this is an argument that kind of is a subset of the arguments from design. And an argument from design is anything where you're basically saying, there's things about the universe that look designed, and so I think there's a designer. And these can be as simple as, look at that beautiful sunset. I don't feel like that could just be a big accident. And actually, that is kind of tied up with fine-tuning, because so the atheist response would be, well, that's just the regular laws of nature and protons, electrons, and the laws of physics that make the sunset. Which I don't see why that would make the sunset so pretty, but putting that aside, all those things that the atheist cites as proof of not design themselves look designed, because they're all narrowly tailored and exactly what they need to be in order to work properly with each other. So, some examples of these. There's a bunch of them. This is a really good book. It's A Fortunate Universe by Luke Barnes, who's a Christian, and Geraint Lewis, who's an atheist. And both of them agree that the universe is finely tuned for life. You can see in this cover, there's a bunch of dead universes that are represented by the black orbs, and then there's the living universe where we exist. And there's all kinds of things that are fine-tuned. Charge of electrons and protons, the mass of quarks, strong force and electromagnetism, Higgs boson, mass and electron. And if you look on this page of this slide, I have the page numbers for this book. They're for this book, A Fortunate Universe. So if you want to look up how these are finely tuned, they're all on those pages. There's other resources and places you can go to on the internet to see examples of fine-tuning. For our purposes today, just know that the universe is fine-tuned. There's two kinds of objections to the fine-tuning argument. There's ones that say there is no fine-tuning, and these are all stupid. These are all ones that miss the point. And then there's ones that say there is fine-tuning, but it doesn't point to a creator. So ones that say there's no fine-tuning, and then ones that say there is fine-tuning, but it doesn't point to a creator. The ones that say that there's no fine-tuning are stupid. The ones that say that it doesn't point to a creator are desperate. They're very, very ad hoc, all of them. Okay, so we could look at brief table of contents of them. There is no fine-tuning. There's a puddle analogy one. What about all the dead planets out there? And it's not an impressive reality. Hydrogen could be impressive. What do you mean by impressive? So all those say there's no fine-tuning, those kind of arguments. Then the arguments that do say that there's fine-tuning but it doesn't point to God are if there was an intelligent creator, he wouldn't need to fine-tune in order to create. I can debunk that pretty well. The multiverse, this is saying that there is fine-tuning but it doesn't point to God. There's all kinds of problems with this idea. And then it just had to be that way, or we're going to make further discoveries that'll show why the constants are what they are. That one's also problematic. So let's start with the puddle analogy. You'll see this on Reddit posts. This is like a typical fedora, neckbeard, atheist style objection here. Wow, this hole in the ground fits me perfectly. It means it's literally shaped exactly like me. It must have been created just for me. If the hole was any other shape, it would not fit in my current form. This kind of objection shows that this person has not read about fine-tuning. Because the way fine-tuning works, it's like if you changed the variables even by like a millimeter, everything would blow up and not even exist. So it's like if you change the mass of an up quark, it doesn't make it where everything's pretty much the same, but now we have blue skin. I mean, it makes it where there's just nothing but like delta plus plus particles in the entire universe, and there's no chemistry. And I have some examples, specific examples of this sort of thing in my notes here. The analogy is false. The puddle can change into all various sorts of shapes, and there's not really a problem. The idea is that the shape of the puddle is what is fine-tuned. This is actually not impressive at all because any other shape of the puddle would be equally fine-tuned, according to the atheists. It shows that this is a disanalogy. Imagine if you change the puddle by 1 millimeter and the entire planet completely exploded, and you're closer to an analogy for fine-tuning. The skeptic here is just making a situation that doesn't need to be fine-tuned and claiming that this is the case with the universal constants. This is not correct. The charge of an up quark is plus 2/3, a down quark is minus 1/3. So if you have two up quarks and one down quark, you add them together and you have a proton that's just plus 1 charge. The electron's negative 1. There's no reason these all need to be whole numbers or exactly the charges they are. So if the proton ends up being exactly plus 1 charge, the electron, coincidentally, it ends up being all negative 1 charge, and all the electrons have the exact same charge, and all the protons have the exact same charge. And we make a big deal about humans inventing interchangeable parts for factory machines where screws are all the same size and parts are all the same size. The universe has interchangeable parts. Why is that? Okay, these are the sorts of things that I took for granted when I was an atheist. But you sit and you think about them. It's like, well, why does it need to be that way? And the more things you add up, that's just, oh, it just had to be that way, had to be that way, had to be that way. You start realizing you have a worldview that's very, very ad hoc. And so the only means of escape is the multiverse, which ends up having ridiculous consequences if you push it. Okay. If you change them at all, then chemistry isn't even possible. If you change the charges on these little particles, you can't even have chemical reactions. Okay. This isn't like a puddle that can go any direction. If you increase the mass of a down quark by a factor of 3, then all that can exist is hydrogen. And that's from page 50 of this book. Decrease the mass of the down quarks by a mere 8%, And protons and atoms will capture the electrons in orbit around them, forming neutrons. Atoms would dissolve into clouds of featureless chemical-free neutrons. There'd be nothing but neutrons, and they couldn't react with each other and make anything heavier. That's from page 51. All up quarks are identical to each other. This is a massive amount of symmetry. Right, so if I showed you a pile of dirt and I showed you a chair where all the legs are the same length, and I said which of these is designed and which isn't. One of them's designed, which let's put aside that the dirt has protons and neutrons and electrons and symmetry between the particles. Just only deal with the macro level for this analogy. You look at the chair, you see the equally length legs. That's symmetry between the legs, and you see the flat place for a butt, and you see a back for the back, and you go, that looks designed. And you might not even know what a chair is for, but looking at it, it would look like, this is designed because there's symmetry, there's beauty, it looks teleological, like there's purpose to it, even if you don't know what the purpose is. Okay, so if you're talking about all these features that let us know that the chair is designed, you see those in the fundamental particles and laws of nature. If this weren't the case, you couldn't have chemistry. Electrons are all the same spin, making them fermions. Bosons can all share the same space, fermions cannot. So what happens is the spin of these electrons are such that they don't just collapse all into one spot. They have to take up space. Things that we just take totally for granted in our everyday life. The fact that you could just change the spin of all these particles and all the particles have the same spin. Okay, well, that's a crazy coincidence. But if you change the spin of these particles to bosons, everything collapses. And let's see what happens. What if electrons were bosons rather than fermions? The result would be disastrous, as there would be nothing to prevent all the electrons occupying the lowest level in an atom. Like stuffing as many photons in the box as you can. Photons are, they can all be stuffed in a box, but you don't want electrons to be like that, or reality as we know it couldn't exist. Once again, wave chemistry and chemical complexity and flexibility needed for life, goodbye. It's page 55 to 56. If the electron mass were within a factor of 100 of the proton mass, the quantum jiggling of electrons would destroy the lattice of solid structures. So imagine atoms lined up in a lattice, and that's how we have solids. In short, there's no solids in this universe. No solids, no planets, no stable DNA molecules, no bones, no semi-permeable living cell walls, no organs. A complete mess, almost certainly no life. And that's page 59. The list of issues goes on, and if you change them, it's not like changing the shape of a puddle and there being no consequences. It's like change a parameter and suddenly nothing but hydrogen can exist. Change one number and suddenly there is no chemistry. This is why I think the puddle analogy might be the dumbest objection of all. I have literally belly laughed at atheists who brought this up. If you want to show me real quick you haven't read anything on the fine-tuning argument, bring up the puddle analogy. And it's so stupid, I almost don't even have the energy to respond. Like in a comment section, well, yeah, the puddle says, what a coincidence. It's like, oh my God, that's stupid. Please go read a book. Please. You're just embarrassing yourself. All right, let me get back to this. On to the next objection. Most of space is dead. This one is another way that clues me in that you've missed the point, right? So there's not like... Fine-tuning shows that there's an intelligence because otherwise you have to assume some ad hoc explanation why all of these different variables line up with each other, all right? And the symmetry between protons and their charges and the gravitational constant and strong and weak nuclear force, they're all finely tuned whether you're on Earth or on a planet or on a dead moon or just out in the middle of empty space. Okay, those laws of nature are all finely tuned for each other to allow things like chemistry no matter where you are. And so the idea isn't that, oh, this is the most life possible that could exist, therefore we think there's a God. No, that's not the fine-tuning argument. The fine-tuning argument is there's these different variables that are intelligently connected together, and that looks like design. And so the fact that there's dead planets out there is irrelevant. It does not matter. It would be like, imagine there's a big factory, and there's just like this factory that's successfully producing cars, and then the factory just has giant empty rooms in it. Okay, so you don't go, well, I guess nothing intelligent made this factory because, even though there's all these intelligently working parts, there's empty parts. It's like, no, that doesn't work. You still need to explain why everything's narrowly tailored to each other. And even that's a disanalogy because you would have to have fine-tuning to have a dead planet anyway, because you need fine-tuning to even have chemistry and to even have particles that are where gravity and the cosmological constant are balanced enough where planets can form. And so already just looking at a ball in space, you go, there has to be design there. Okay? Yeah, and you don't even need life to run a fine-tuning argument. All you need is a bunch of variables that are all balanced with each other. Okay, not impressive. What if there was a God, he could just make intelligent hydrogen? These kind of miss the point also. Let me go one more slide, or two more slides. This slide will deal with 2 slides ago. Objections that stipulate fine-tuning but say it doesn't point to God. There's this line of reasoning where they say, well, if God existed, and then they would try to come up with a universe that looks different from ours, right? God wouldn't need to fine-tune to create. Therefore, fine-tuning isn't evidence of God. But let's say you wake up in the morning and you go downstairs and you find a waffle and you say, well, Christians are saying that this is evidence of a breakfast maker, but I don't think this is a breakfast maker because a breakfast maker could have made a pancake. Right? A breakfast maker wouldn't need to make waffles, therefore waffles aren't evidence of a breakfast maker. Doesn't logically follow, right? The waffle points to a breakfast maker. A breakfast maker doesn't necessarily point to a waffle, but a waffle does point to a breakfast maker. Okay, so let's put that with our universe. An intelligent creator doesn't necessarily point to fine-tuning, but fine-tuning does point to an intelligent creator. Okay, so it's irrelevant that God could make other things. We have this universe that we have that is the sort of thing that requires an intelligent causation to make any sense. That points to God, right? We don't go, well, God exists, therefore we have to have a universe like this. We go, we have a universe like this, therefore there has to be a God. Okay, so once that's cleared up, you realize the intelligent hydrogen objection is stupid. Saying that it's not impressive is stupid too. Yeah, there is sort of a subjective element to something being interesting. Right, so earlier, the design of the chair, I said there's beauty to it. And you might say, well, beauty is subjective. Like, okay. But like an ugly pile of dirt versus a chair, yeah, it's just our opinions that the beautiful chair is, let's say Hagia Sophia. Okay, so it's just our opinions that Hagia Sophia is more beautiful than a pile of dirt. Sure, but I feel like there's something objective about saying Hagia Sophia is more beautiful than a pile of dirt, even though it's just an opinion. I will say this about an intelligent hydrogen world. If you even just having hydrogen would require fine-tuning, but it wouldn't be as impressive as this universe. But in the same way, like if I'm walking through the woods and I find a perfectly carved cup, that's evidence of intelligent design. Now imagine I'm walking through the woods, I find an entire factory making cars. That's also evidence of an intelligent creator. The factory is just a more impressive evidence of an intelligent creator, but both point to an intelligent creator. So even if you had a universe that was just hydrogen, but all the protons are symmetrical to each other, they all have the same charge, the electrons all have the same charge, they're all symmetrical to each other, etc., this would still point to a creator. But it would just not be as impressive of a creation as our universe, which is awesome. Our universe is awesome. Okay. Now, I'll talk about, there's this really interesting idea that Luke Barnes comes up with a made-up game called Schmess to try to help explain what interesting means. If the amount of dark energy were changed, all that could exist is helium. Is this an uninteresting universe? What does interesting mean? There's a subjective element to it, but after a certain point, it gets ridiculous, right? It would be like saying a pile of dirt in Hagia Sophia, it's all your opinion. What's more beautiful? We may not know exactly what life is or exactly how life forms, but we know that life isn't that. It isn't just nothing but helium. Such a universe would be fantastically simple, since matter would never get together in large enough numbers to make anything more complicated than a hydrogen molecule. Still, I would argue that even a hydrogen universe would have to be finely tuned, but it just wouldn't be as finely tuned as ours. But anyway, let's keep going. Because gravity won't make matter collapse into galaxies or stars or planets or anything, physics is easy, too simple for anything like life. At this point, people often play the science fiction card and retort that such a simple universe could contain life not as we know it. Life so extraordinary and bizarre that our puny human minds could not even conceive of its existence. But the important word here is fiction. Any genesis of life we consider must be based in science, not science fiction. Any universe in which life can arise must provide the conditions for the storage and processing of information. Right? That's a big component of life. The way that we store information and then are able to propagate it onto the next generation of life. A thin soup of only hydrogen and helium simply does not provide this. Let's continue thinking about simple versus complex universes with an illustration. Suppose we're trying to invent a new board game. It will be a bit like chess, but with slightly different rules. As a first attempt, we'll make one small change to the rules. Instead of stating that the only piece that can jump over other pieces is the knight, our new game says that the only piece that can jump over other pieces is the bishop. Instead of chess, we've invented schmess. Right? If you see a chessboard in your mind, no, you can move your bishop, and in one turn, you can checkmate the other side. Is Smash an interesting game? Wait a minute, we haven't defined what the term interesting. How can we decide whether a game is interesting if we don't know exactly what the term means, or if different people find different things interesting? Here's let me see if I can see this. I want you to see a picture of Schmess, right? It's to see how the bishop moves out over here. And then you can checkmate the other side in one turn. Okay. Let me get back to this. Is Schmess an interesting game? Wait a minute. We haven't defined the term interesting. How can we decide whether a game is interesting if we don't know exactly what the term means, or if different people find different things interesting? In the end, it doesn't much matter. Part of what makes chess interesting is its admirers is the intricacy of its strategy. Chess strategy textbooks can be hundreds of pages long, and grandmasters spent a lifetime mastering the game. If, on the other hand, we were to write an introduction to the strategy of Schmess, it would need 2 sentences. White moves her bishop from f1 to b5. Checkmate. That's it. That's the entire game. The game is over before black has his first move. We don't need a precise definition of interesting to conclude that a game in which one player always wins and the other player always does nothing is not an interesting game. The game is too simple. We know what would happen in a game of Schmess, and we know that none of those things are interesting. Let's expand the example. Suppose you've been inventing new board games all afternoon. You've tried 1,000 different sets of rules, and all but 2 are boring as Schmess. Now we could argue about which definition of interesting is really the right one, and whether these 2 games are really interesting. But the big story here is how rare interesting games are in the set of possible games. If you have randomized rules, it's rare to have an interesting game, a conclusion that we could reach without precisely defining interesting. The reason is that in order to conclude most games are not interesting, we don't need to decide the borderline cases. We only need to be able to identify obviously non-interesting games. Similarly, all we need for an investigation of fine-tuning is to be able to identify an example of obviously non-living things. And I would say even less than that, but I don't think you need life for a fine-tuning argument. If a universe is simple enough, we can safely conclude that nothing as complex as life could form. Okay. Causal options. So those are all of our objections that say there is no fine-tuning. Let's look at the ones that say there is fine-tuning, but it doesn't point to God. And they say it doesn't point to God because it was made that way by random chance. And this is your multiverse hypothesis. It was made this way deterministically. There was no other... it couldn't be anything else except what it is. And then 3, it's designed that way. The way to argue random chance is through the multiverse. So it is the definition of ad hoc. So ad hoc is something formed or used for specific or immediate problems or needs. Imagine seeing order and assuming there's an unlimited, unmeasurable disorder to explain it. So I see like a a talking monkey, and I go, oh, I guess there's just an unlimited number of universes out there, and I just happen to be in the one where there's this monkey that can talk. Instead of like saying, well, maybe there's a scientist who put a chip in its brain and there's this intelligent design. If I just say, well, there's you can explain anything with there's an unlimited number of universe, and I just happen to be in the one where this happens. And there's actually a lot of analogies between multiverse problems and people who reject the principle of sufficient reason or adequate reason. Because remember, once you say, well, things can happen without a cause, you can't run any probabilities. You can't do inductive or abductive logic anymore. And so knowledge collapses. The same way with the universe, you could say, well, anything could happen randomly and knowledge collapses because it might just be a product of the multiverse. And my old atheist self would have been like, well, God can just do anything. Well, it's like if he has a certain character and he's good, you can see how an intelligent creator would make a stable, uniform universe where random things aren't happening all the time. And so a randomized, unintelligent multiverse cannot compete with an intelligent causation hypothesis for describing an ordered universe where the PSR is true, for example, where things have an explanation. Imagine seeing order assuming, yeah. Okay, so this is from a book called There Is a God by Antony Flew. He was a lifelong atheist, and he became a deist near the end. And he has a part in his book where he talks about why he rejects this idea that life can just come from randomness, but we're going to apply it to fine-tuning. The same arguments for saying life can't just come from randomness can apply to fine-tuning, not just coming from randomness. Flew uses this for life arising, but the critique works against the fine-tuned constants coming from something random as well. This is Flew speaking. I was particularly impressed with Jerry Schroeder's point-by-point refutation of what I call the monkey theorem. This idea, which has been presented in a number of forms and variations, defends the possibility of life arising by chance using the analogy of a multitude of monkeys banging away on computer keyboards and eventually ending up writing a Shakespearean sonnet. Schroeder first referred to an experiment conducted by the British National Council of Arts. A computer was placed in a cage with 6 monkeys. After 1 month of hammering away at it, as well as using it as a bathroom, the monkeys produced 50 typed pages, but not a single word. Schroeder noted that this was the case even though the shortest word in the English language is one letter, A or I. A word is only there if there is a space on either side of it. If we take it that the keyboard has 30 characters, 26 letters, and other symbols, then the likelihood of getting a one-letter word is 30 times 30 times 30, which is 27,000. The likelihood of getting one-letter word is 1 out of 27,000. So they have these 6 monkeys in there for a month, and they don't even get a single word of English. Schroeder then applied the probabilities to the sonnet analogy. What's the chance of getting a Shakespearean sonnet? He asked. He continued. All the sonnets are the same length. They're by definition 14 lines long. That's way more than just one word. I picked the line I knew the opening line for. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? I counted the number of letters. There's 488 letters in that sonnet. What's the likelihood of hammering away and getting 488 letters in the exact sequence as in, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? What you end up with is 26 multiplied by itself 488 times, or 26 to the 488th power. Or in other words, in the base 10 scientific notation, it's 10 to the 690th power. So that's a massive number. Now, the number of particles in the universe, not grains of sand, I'm talking about protons, electrons, and neutrons, is 10 to the 80th. 10 to the 80th is 1 with 80 zeros after it. 10 to the 690th is 1 with 690 zeros after it. So magnitudes larger than the number of particles in our universe. There are not enough particles in the universe to write down the trials. You'd be off by a factor of 10 to the 600th. If you took the entire universe and converted it to computer chips, forget the monkeys, each computer chip weighing a millionth of a gram, and each computer chip able to spin out 488 trials at 1,000,000 times a second. If you turn the entire universe into these microchips, and these chips are spinning 1,000,000 times a second, producing random letters, the number of trials you would get since the beginning of time would be 10 to the 90th trials. That's it. You would be off again by a factor of 10 to the 600th. You will never get a sonnet by chance. The universe would have to be 10 to the 600th times larger. Part of why we miss the power of these fine-tuning arguments is because we're not able to comprehend numbers as big as 10 to the 600th. We just go, oh, well, if it's randomized enough, we can end up having a universe that doesn't need design. No, you don't get it. This is impossible. Yet the world just thinks the monkeys can do it every time. After hearing Schroeder's presentation, I told him that he had very satisfactorily and decisively established that the monkey theorem was a load of rubbish, and that it was particularly good to do it with just a sonnet. The theorem is sometimes proposed using the works of Shakespeare, or imagine all of the DNA of even a single cell organism, or a single play, such as Hamlet. If the theorem won't work for a single sonnet, then of course it's simply absurd to suggest that the more elaborate feat of the origin of life could have been achieved by chance. That's Anthony Flew, There Is a God, pages 75 to 78. Okay. All right, let's keep on going. So, random chance is looking dumber and dumber. Okay, and this is something I thought of. It's not from a professional philosopher, but okay, so if you have a multiverse with all these randomized universes out there with randomized rules, there's going to be at least one universe, since there's an infinite number of them, that is able to interact with our universe. And so we can run a modus tollens argument. If there is a multiverse with randomized variables, at least one of them is going to interrupt our universe. Now, do we see aliens just opening up portals in the sky and coming through? No, we don't. But this gets worse, right? So if you have an infinite number of universes, then there would actually be any subset of an infinity is also an infinity. So you would actually have an infinite number of universes interacting with ours all the time. And you go, well, maybe they're doing that, but we just can't see it. If there's infinite ones and they're randomized variables, at least one of those would be where we would see the things that are happening when they're interacting with us, right? And so there would be total chaos all the time, all across the multiverse. You couldn't have the order that's needed to separate the universes into different pockets. It would be all chaos all the time, and there would be at least an infinite number of universes out there that just have nothing but antimatter. And so everything would be getting obliterated all the time. There would be at least a universe that there's juice in it that leaks through a portal and turns everything it touches into ducks. Okay? So once again, you're seeing the idiocy of the way the atheists try to avoid design. Just like with the PSR, there's so many analogies and similarities between trying to deny the PSR and trying to say that there's a multiverse to explain everything. You end up with absurdities where you can't even do logic anymore. Something else about a multiverse is if order is the product of randomized chaos, then the most likely option for why you see order around you is because you're just a brain experiencing that amount of order, because that would take orders of magnitude less energy and organization to create the same sensations. So this is called the Boltzmann brain problem, but you collapse into solipsism being infinitely more likely than an actual real universe if there is a multiverse. So that's another problem. There's all kinds of problems with the multiverse, and it's just ad hoc. It feels like something where somebody saw fine-tuning, they panicked, and they tried to make up something to explain away the data so they could sleep at night because they don't want there to be a God. All right, determinism. This is the idea that things are just the way they are, and that's the way it had to be. This captures claims like once science advances, we'll find an explanation for the universal constants, but whatever this explanation is, it too would be fine-tuned to set the parameters where they are. Right? There is no escape from fine-tuning. If there's fine-tuning on a more macro level, there's going to be fine-tuning on a more foundational level as well. Stephen Barr is a physicist, and he puts it this way: order in, order out. If you have a system and you see order on the macro level, that means there's order on the micro level. The other common claim is that there is no choice but the universal constants to be what they are. This is almost as ad hoc as the multiverse. And this is why you'd have to just go through every single variable. Oh, the mass of an electron, it just has to be that way by brute fact necessity. The mass of a proton, it has to be that way by brute fact necessity. The strong and weak nuclear forces, they have to be that way by necessity. And you might go, well, you have a God who has to be there by necessity. Fine, but every worldview is going to have at least one brute fact. Theists have one. They just have one brute fact, God, right? He necessarily exists. If you're going with the determinism route, you have totally correct. The gravitational constant just had to be that way. The strong nuclear force just had to be that way by necessity. No explanation. The weak nuclear force just had to be that way. No explanation by necessity. And you can add up more and more and more. And it's like looking at a computer program and seeing the lines of code and just being like, this isn't evidence of a programmer. The lines just had to be that way. Everything just had to line up exactly where the program isn't crashing all the time. And it just had to be that way. It's desperate. This is a desperate explanation, just like the multiverse. Another thing to help with this is when atheists say, you don't have any evidence that they could be changed, let's talk about modal logic for a second. We used it back with the ontological argument, but this idea of possibilities versus necessities. Okay, and we can see things with our minds that are necessary, like 1 + 1 = 2. You could just see that that's necessary with your mind, right? Or if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. You can tell in every possible world, modus ponens is going to have to be true. But there is nothing about the mass of an electron being 9 × 10 to the -31 kilograms that makes it seem like it's necessarily that way. Okay, it's just that's just the number that we measure the masses at, and it just happens to be exactly what that needs to be. It happens to be exactly the mass it needs to be for everything to work properly. And I think this is why Christopher Hitchens admitted that fine-tuning is a really strong argument, as you can see in this clip.
At some point, certainly, we're all asked, well, which is the best argument you've yet come up against from the other side? And I think every one of us picks the fine-tuning one as the most intriguing.
The Goldilocks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Fine-tuning the 1 degree, 1 hair different to nothing. But even though it doesn't prove a designer could all have happened without it, you have to spend time thinking about it, working on it. It's not a trivial. We all say that.
Of course, though, he actually is wrong. There isn't an answer to fine-tuning. Not one that isn't completely stupid, like denying that it exists, or that is totally ad hoc and desperate, which is trying to say that it doesn't point to God, it's some other thing. Random, nope. Determinism, nope. A mind that is intelligent avoids ad hoc and coheres with the cosmological argument. And so one of the ways you could tell a theory is good is if seemingly unrelated arguments all point in the same direction, right? So if you have arguments where you seem to need to have a finitism of causes, you can't have an infinite amount of time. It looks like you need to have a free will agent to create things because it needs to be able to act without having a causal chain attached to it. And then it looks like it needs to be intelligent. And then how could we have objective morals or an objective duty to seek truth? It seems like there would need to be a foundational mind out there with should statements, not just is statements. And so you end up having all these problems that we need to explain in the universe, and one explanation fixes all of them. That gives more power to that explanation. It's more parsimonious. It has a greater explanatory scope. It's less ad hoc. It has more explanatory power. God, right? If you just say there's a God, if you just admit there's a God, it ends up solving all of these problems. Boom, you have God. Okay, that's it. I have to go to work. I hope you all have a blessed day.